In March of 1891, when city officials finally forced open the locks on the basement morgue of St. Mercy General Hospital in Boston's North End, they uncovered 213 patient files, each meticulously detailed and all bearing the same cryptic phrase, "called to glory during sacred treatment." What made these records horrifying wasn't only the staggering number of deaths across 16 years, but the identical final symptoms that didn't resemble any known disease of that era. The Catholic diocese quickly sealed away all documents, but not before investigators made copies that revealed a pattern so disturbing it threatened to shatter everything the Irish immigrant community believed about divine healing. Before we step deeper into this chilling history of St. Mercy General Hospital, I need to make something clear: this channel isn't for everyone. Only the boldest souls dare explore the darkest corners of America's religious past, and very few channels are willing to tell the kinds of stories we reveal here. If you're one of those rare people, unafraid to uncover terrifying truths that powerful institutions tried desperately to bury, then hit that subscribe button now. And I want to know, drop a comment below, telling me which city or state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to be part of our circle of truth seekers? Let's find out together what really happened in those underground chambers of St. Mercy General Hospital. The tale begins in 1874, though its roots stretch back to the devastating potato famine that drove countless Irish Catholics across the Atlantic, carrying little more than faith and desperation. Boston's North End in 1874 was a maze of cramped cobblestone streets where Gaelic was heard more often than English. The Irish immigrants, packed into narrow tenements, had fled starvation only to find a different sort of suffering in America. Yellow fever outbreaks were frequent, factory accidents crippled workers daily, and childbirth claimed mothers at alarming rates. The Protestant-run hospitals charged fees far beyond what Irish families could afford, and some refused Catholic patients altogether, citing so-called moral objections to their religious practices. Into this void stepped Dr. Charles Whitman, Sister Margaret O'Connor, and Chaplain Robert Sullivan. In the spring of 1874, they announced the opening of St. Mercy General Hospital, a beacon of divine healing for God's forgotten children. The three-story brick building on Salem Street had once been a textile warehouse, but the trio spent months transforming it into what appeared to be a proper medical facility. The first floor held a reception area dominated by a massive wooden crucifix, treatment rooms outfitted with genuine medical equipment, and a small chapel where patients prayed before procedures. The second floor contained patient wards with 20 beds, each carved with religious symbols. But it was the basement that would become the source of nightmares, what they called the sacred treatment chambers, where, they claimed, the most miraculous healings took place. Dr. Whitman displayed prestigious credentials from the University of Edinburgh, boasting a specialization in experimental therapeutics guided by divine blessing. He was a tall, gaunt man in his 50s, with piercing blue eyes and prematurely white hair kept meticulously combed. His hands were spotless, and he always wore a silver cross pinned to his lapel, small details that made desperate families trust him without hesitation. Sister Margaret O'Connor looked every bit the devoted Catholic nun, her traditional habit and rosary never leaving her side, with her soft Irish lilt and gentle touch. She had an uncanny gift for soothing frightened patients with whispered prayers. Chaplain Sullivan, robust with a booming voice, led services that echoed for blocks. His fiery sermons on divine healing drew hundreds, and his blessing ceremonies became legendary throughout the Irish Quarter. Soon, the hospital's reputation spread by word of mouth. Testimonies too miraculous to dismiss rippled through the community. A child with terminal consumption leaving healthy within days, broken bones healing overnight, fevers breaking in an instant after blessed treatments in the basement chambers. Some elderly patients even regained vitality they hadn't known in decades. For those who couldn't pay, treatments were free. said to be funded by anonymous benefactors acting out of Christian charity. What made the stories most convincing was their detail. Margaret Flynn, for example, swore her son Tommy had been dying of pneumonia until, after 3 days of sacred treatment, he was running through the streets, healthier than ever. Patrick O'Brien insisted his wife Mary had been cured of consumption after 3 other doctors declared her beyond saving. These weren't vague claims of improvement. These were complete transformations that defied all medical logic. The Irish Catholic community embraced St. Mercy as living proof that God favored their suffering. Father McKenna of St. Leonard's Church regularly sent parishioners there, praising Dr. Whitman's union of science and divine grace. The Boston Pilot, the Irish Catholic newspaper, ran glowing features on the Miracle Hospital of the North End. Even skeptical Protestant papers admitted something remarkable seemed to be happening, attributing it to the powerful influence of faith over immigrant minds. By 1876, the hospital was treating nearly 200 patients a month, with waiting lists stretching weeks. Families camped on cobblestones outside, hoping for their loved ones to be chosen. Whitman claimed he accepted patients through divine guidance, insisting he prayed over every application and admitted only those God revealed were ready for healing. This selective process only deepened the hospital's mystique. Requests to observe the procedures, like one from Dr. Harrison Wells of Massachusetts General, were politely refused. Whitman explained with a calm smile that divine healing required pure faith, unspoiled by scientific doubt. He insisted his medicines were purified through prayer, made potent by holy blessing ceremonies. But the facade cracked one fog-shrouded October morning in 1876. 8-year-old Bridget McCarthy stumbled out of the basement chambers in a state that witnesses struggled to describe. Her hands were clenched so tightly, her nails cut her palms, her movements stiff and unnatural, like a wind-up doll. Her eyes were wide but vacant, as though she wasn't seeing this world at all. And the smell that followed her, sweet, yet rotten, like flowers left too long on a grave, made witnesses recoil. Mrs. Catherine O'Malley, waiting for her husband's treatment, watched in horror as Bridget's lips moved soundlessly until Sister Margaret rushed forward. Suddenly, the girl spoke in a guttural, otherworldly Latin that even seasoned churchgoers didn't recognize. Dr. Whitman appeared almost instantly, visibly shaken. He scooped Bridget up, muttering about divine visions overwhelming her mind, and carried her back to the basement. But before he disappeared, Mrs. O'Malley noticed something she would never forget. Bridget's fingernails were black as ink, though they had been normal just 2 days earlier. The following day, her mother Ellen was told Bridget had been called home to God, her body already buried in the hospital's private cemetery. Chaplain Sullivan soothed the grieving woman with tales of her daughter's saintly purity, assuring her that Bridget now interceded in heaven for other sick children. The tragedy might have ended there, except 3 days later, Patrick O'Malley walked out of his own basement treatment, entirely cured of tuberculosis. His miraculous recovery overshadowed the questions surrounding Bridget's death. Word of Patrick's cure swept the North End, and St. Mercy's reputation grew stronger than ever. Yet Mrs. O'Malley could not forget what she had seen. She began to notice a disturbing pattern. Patients either emerged completely cured, or never came out at all. There was no middle ground, and that, she realized, was the true horror of St. Mercy. Despite Mrs. O'Malley's growing suspicions, the community's faith in St. Mercy remained firm. The living, walking testimonies of cured patients were too powerful to ignore. People saw neighbors who had been given up for dead walking the streets, again with full health evidence too visible to be doubted. Deaths, by contrast, were explained away as God's will, His choice to call the purest souls home to heaven. Dr. Whitman's reputation only grew. Patients arrived not just from Boston, but from New York, Philadelphia, and beyond. By the winter of 1878, St. Mercy General Hospital had become something greater than a medical facility. It had become the spiritual heart of Boston's Irish Catholic community. Sunday services led by Chaplain Sullivan drew congregations of more than 400 people. Families packed the chapel until there was no room left, overflowing into treatment rooms. His sermons centered on themes of suffering, sacrifice, and divine testing, conditioned families for the possibility that their loved ones might be chosen for heavenly service during treatment. Meanwhile, Dr. Whitman's rituals grew increasingly elaborate. Patients selected for basement treatment underwent 3 full days of preparation. Sister Margaret O'Connor guided them through fasting, intensive prayer, and what she called spiritual purification. Specialties brewed from herbs, she claimed, had been blessed by bishops. In Rome, families were warned that shortcuts or impure thoughts might prevent miracles from manifesting. Wealthy Catholic families across New England began making large donations to support the miracle work. In 1879, the Fitzgeralds of Providence gifted $5,000 after their daughter's consumption was cured in the basement chambers. The O'Briens of Hartford contributed $3,000 when their son's broken spine was healed overnight. These donations allowed Whitman to expand the underground facilities, what he proudly called the Advanced Sacred Treatment Chambers, complete with specialized equipment he said had come from divine blueprints revealed through prayer. But not everyone was convinced. Dr. Samuel Richardson of Boston City Hospital quietly began tracking St. Mercy's death certificates. The records troubled him. Causes of death rarely matched family reports. Patients who entered with consumption were listed as dying of heart failure. Children with broken bones were said to have succumbed to brain fever. Stranger still, the official time of death was always recorded between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. No matter what witnesses claimed. Dr. Richardson grew more alarmed when he tried to examine some bodies at Flanagan's funeral home, which handled many St. Mercy burials for poorer families. Michael Flanagan, the funeral director, admitted something unusual. Coffins from St. Mercy always arrived sealed, with strict orders never to be opened. The hospital says it's for public health, Flanagan told Richardson uneasily. But I've been handling diseased bodies for 20 years. I've never seen restrictions like this. They deliver them in the middle of the night, always with 2 men who stay until I sign the papers. Then they leave right away. Something isn't right. Richardson tried to raise his concerns with city health officials, only to be told that the hospital was under the protection of Boston's Catholic diocese. Any investigation, they said, would require approval from church authorities. Bishop Williams himself had visited St. Mercy and publicly praised Whitman's blending of medicine and divine grace. With the bishop's blessing, secular officials dared not press further for fear of appearing to attack the Catholic Church itself. Meanwhile, Mrs. Catherine O'Malley had begun her own informal investigation, driven by the haunting memory of Bridget McCarthy's last moments. She visited grieving families, offering sympathy, while carefully gathering details. Her findings were chilling. Every story carried the same elements: violent seizures lasting exactly 13 minutes, fingernails turning black, and that same unforgettable smell, sweet decayed, clinging to clothing for weeks after death. Even stranger, families described bizarre, final moments before death. Some swore their loved ones spoke in languages they'd never known. Others recited what sounded like mathematical equations or scientific formulas in voices that didn't sound like their own. Sarah Murphy, in tears, recalled her husband's final hours. He just kept repeating numbers. Always the same: 73.4, 41.7, 92.1. Then he'd pause, exactly 30 seconds, and start again. And each time, his voice got deeper, like someone else was speaking through him. Thomas Kelly told her how his young daughter, in her last hours, described in perfect detail rooms she had never seen, laboratories filled with bottles and strange apparatus. She even named people she'd never met, describing their work as if she were standing right there beside them. But perhaps the most disturbing was the account of Elizabeth Connolly, whose husband Sean died after treatment for a simple broken leg. Sean, barely literate, suddenly began speaking fluent Latin, not the familiar Latin of Mass, but something far more complex. Father McKenna, called to give last rites, admitted he didn't recognize many of the words, though some resembled ancient medical terminology used only in universities. Elizabeth's voice shook as she continued. What terrified me wasn't just the words. It was how he changed, his whole manner. Cold, calculating. He started asking me questions about money, about family connections, about who would come looking for him if he went missing. That wasn't my Sean speaking. It was someone, or something else. When I begged him to stop, he just looked at me with eyes that weren't his own and said, "Information has value, Elizabeth. Everything has value if you know the right buyers." Mrs. O'Malley documented every word, and then came Timothy O'Brien's case, just 12 years old, brought in with pneumonia. His mother Margaret recalled how Timothy began speaking what sounded like German or some other foreign tongue. More disturbingly, he began to draw intricate diagrams of machines and chemical instruments no child his age could possibly imagine, let alone sketch with such accuracy. When Margaret asked him where he had learned such things, Timothy answered, softly, "They were already in my head. I just had to draw them." But the most unsettling part was his eerie knowledge of coming events. He predicted the ringing of church bells to the minute, foretold rain before the clouds gathered, and knew exactly which neighbors would arrive at their home before they knocked on the door, and then he predicted his own death, down to the very minute, on the morning of his final day. Timothy told his mother he would die at 3:47 p.m., and that his body would be carried away in a wooden box that same evening. And everything happened exactly as he said. Timothy O'Brien's case left the community shaken. Yet strangely, it also strengthened belief in St. Mercy. His death, they said, was simply another example of God calling a pure soul to higher service. Families clung to the miracle cures they could see with their own eyes, while the disturbing deaths were softened by the church's explanation of divine will. But Mrs. O'Malley could no longer ignore the pattern. She began comparing notes, documenting everything she heard. The seizures always lasted 13 minutes. The fingernails always turned black. The smell of decay never failed to linger. And the strange, otherworldly languages spoken by the dying became too consistent to be coincidence. What terrified her most were the details that suggested knowledge no ordinary immigrant, laborer, or child could possess. Perfect Latin, complex formulas, descriptions of laboratories, predictions of events before they occurred. It seemed as though, in their final hours, these patients were channeling information from somewhere, or someone else. Dr. Richardson, too pressed forward with his private investigation. He tried to gather medical evidence, but at every turn, he was blocked. The hospital refused him entry. City officials deferred to the diocese. Even funeral homes were forbidden from opening St. Mercy's sealed coffins. Still, whispers spread through Boston's North End. Some families began questioning the true nature of the basement chambers. Why were the cures so absolute, and the deaths so identical? Why was it always the basement? By 1880, unease had grown to the point that even some parish priests quietly expressed doubts. But Bishop Williams remained unwavering, praising Dr. Whitman as a man blessed with a rare gift of physician, chosen by God to heal through sacred science. With such public endorsement, dissenting voices were drowned out. Meanwhile, donations continued pouring in. Wealthy Catholic families across New England sent money, convinced their generosity was fueling divine miracles. St. Mercy expanded again, its reputation spreading even further. Yet behind the glowing reports and overflowing chapels, shadows deepened. Families whispered about loved ones who entered the basement never to return. Mothers quietly admitted that their children's final moments were not peaceful, but filled with terror. And Mrs. O'Malley, her notebooks growing thicker by the month, wondered if anyone would ever believe her, because by then, she had come to a chilling realization: the deaths weren't random. They were following a system, and whatever was happening in those chambers, it wasn't divine. In the winter of 1885, Mrs. O'Malley finally gained access to something concrete. A janitor, troubled by what he had witnessed, slipped her a stack of discarded note scribbles written in Dr. Whitman's unmistakable hand. They weren't medical records. They were equations, pages upon pages of geometric patterns, alchemical diagrams, and strange invocations, written partly in Latin, partly in German, and partly in an unrecognizable script. When she showed them to Dr. Richardson, his face went pale. He admitted he didn't understand the symbols, but he recognized fragments that had no place in medicine: references to transmutation, to energy drawn from human essence, even to experiments in prolonging consciousness beyond death. The two began comparing the notes with her diaries of patient deaths. A frightening pattern became undeniable. The seizures weren't a medical side effect. They were deliberate. They marked the final stage of an experiment. And more chilling still, each victim's passing wasn't meaningless. It was a transfer. In 1887, a whistleblower inside St. Mercy finally exposed enough to break the silence. He claimed that patients marked for sacred treatment were being prepared in secret rituals overseen by Dr. Whitman himself. The procedures combined medicine with something far older, something occult, according to the witness. The glowing recoveries weren't miracles at all, but siphoned vitality. The deaths were not just tragedies, they were sacrifices, energy, drained from the weak to fuel cures for the chosen few. When this information began to leak, city officials could no longer ignore it. A raid was ordered in March of 1891. What they found in the basement confirmed the darkest suspicions. Rows of locked cabinets held more than 200 patient files, all marked with the same chilling notation: called to glory during sacred treatment. The records revealed identical symptoms, identical timelines, and identical deaths spanning over 16 years. Even more disturbing, investigators uncovered glass vials filled with a dark, coagulated substance, stored in racks like wine bottles. Ledger notes suggested it was blood, preserved during extraction. The hospital was immediately shuttered. The diocese moved quickly to silence the scandal, seizing most documents and branding the discoveries as exaggerated. But not before. Richardson and O'Malley preserved copies of what they'd seen, and then Dr. Whitman vanished. Some claimed he fled to Europe under church protection. Others whispered he had succeeded in his work, transcending death entirely. What is certain is this: St. Mercy General was never reopened. Its building was eventually demolished, its land repurposed, its history buried under layers of official denial. Yet fragments survived. Copies of the files circulated among private collectors of the macabre. Rumors spread through occult circles about the Boston experiments, and descendants of the victims still tell stories of sudden seizures, whispered languages, and the stink of decay in their ancestors' final moments. To this day, the Catholic diocese refuses to acknowledge the case, but the surviving notes, the witness testimony, and the 213 files remain proof, perhaps, that the miracle of St. Mercy was never a miracle at all, but something far darker. For decades, the case of St. Mercy General lingered only in whispers, in old newspaper clippings, sealed church archives, and the hushed memories of Boston's North End. Most assumed the story ended in 1891 with Whitman's disappearance. But here's the unsettling part. In 1973, during renovations of a nearby tenement, workers uncovered a sealed trunk hidden behind a brick wall. Inside were more of Whitman's papers, diagrams, nearly identical to the ones Mrs. O'Malley had copied. What made them disturbing wasn't just the writing itself, but the fact that someone had been updating them. The ink and paper dated to the 1940s, half a century after Whitman supposedly vanished. Then, in 2009, a medical researcher at Harvard quietly published a paper on energy transfer anomalies in terminal patients. It was dismissed as pseudoscience, but the language mirrored Whitman's notes word for word. When pressed for comment, the researcher claimed the terminology came from an obscure 19th-century Boston case study. To this day, no one knows how he got access to those files. Some historians believe Whitman's experiments inspired fringe medical movements in Europe. Others argue they laid the groundwork for darker projects in the 20th century quiet programs that blurred the line between science and ritual. And here's the detail that refuses to fade. Every single time those notes resurface, reports follow of unexplained seizures, sudden deaths, or entire wards of patients deteriorating without clear cause. It's as though the research itself carries a curse. The church, the city, and modern medical institutions continue to deny any connection. Yet the 213 files, the vanished doctor, and the recurring patterns suggest otherwise. Perhaps St. Mercy General was not an isolated tragedy of the 1800s, but the beginning of something that never really ended. He said, "It always seemed that just when Mrs. O'Malley believed she was uncovering proof of something sinister, she would encounter one of the so-called miracle patients, whose recovery appeared so complete and dramatic that it unsettled her growing suspicions." Her own husband, Patrick, remained in perfect health, his lungs stronger than men half his age. Michael Sullivan, injured in a construction accident that should have left him permanently paralyzed, now worked 14-hour days without the slightest sign of fatigue. These remarkable recoveries couldn't be dismissed or explained away easily, creating a maddening paradox that kept the community's faith intact, even as mounting signs suggested something was terribly wrong. The winter of 1880 brought an unusually brutal blizzard that buried Boston beneath nearly 4 feet of snow for almost 2 weeks. During this time, when the hospital was completely isolated from the outside world, neighbors reported strange lights glowing from the basement windows throughout the night. These weren't the steady flames of oil lamps or gas fixtures, but flickering, shifting colors green, blue, and deep purple. When the storm finally ended and the hospital resumed normal operations, 17 patients who had been receiving treatment during the blizzard were reported to have ascended to heavenly glory during what they called the sacred storm. By spring of 1881, an unexpected visitor arrived at St. Mercy General Hospital, one who would forever alter the course of events. Father Joseph Benedetti had been sent from the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of Saints to investigate the miraculous healings that had reached Rome. Unlike the local clergy, who embraced St. Mercy without hesitation, Father Benedetti approached with a methodical, almost scientific rigor. For 15 years he had examined supposed divine interventions across Europe, developing careful techniques to separate genuine miracles from elaborate frauds. A small, quiet man in his early 60s, Benedetti had sharp gray eyes that missed nothing and a voice that compelled truth from those he questioned. He spoke fluent English, touched only by a slight Italian accent, and often surprised people with his deep knowledge of medical science. What made him particularly dangerous to deception was his academic background. He had studied chemistry and anatomy at the University of Bologna before entering the priesthood. Dr. Whitman greeted Father Benedetti with apparent enthusiasm, granting full access to patient records and treatment facilities. "We have nothing to hide from God's representative," he declared publicly. Yet Mrs. O'Malley noticed the doctor's hands trembling slightly as he shook the priest's. "Our work here is blessed by divine grace, and we welcome any chance to demonstrate the miraculous power of faith combined with medicine." Benedetti began by reviewing documented cases of miraculous healing, requesting full medical records from before and after treatment. Immediately, inconsistencies emerged. The before records were detailed symptoms, vital signs, disease, progression, but the after records were astonishingly sparse. Most simply stated, patient responded completely to sacred treatment, all symptoms resolved, discharged in perfect health. When Benedetti sought to interview the supposedly cured, new obstacles arose. Many celebrated patients had apparently moved away from Boston shortly after recovery, leaving no forwarding addresses. Others had inexplicably died from unrelated causes, despite their perfect health. Those he could find and speak with often displayed troubling memory gaps. They remembered entering the basement chambers, then waking completely healed but recalled nothing of what had happened in between. Michael Sullivan, the construction worker once paralyzed, agreed to meet with the priest, but struggled to recall coherent details. "It's the strangest thing, Father," he admitted, scratching his head. "I remember Sister Margaret giving me teat, tasted like bitter almonds, and then everything goes fuzzy. I dreamed, or at least I think they were dreams, of floating above my body, watching men in white coats do things I couldn't quite see. When I woke, I could walk again, stronger than before. But sometimes I dream of being in a place both freezing cold and burning hot, with voices speaking languages I don't know." From here, Father Benedetti's investigation grew more serious. He requested permission to observe a sacred treatment firsthand. Dr. Whitman initially agreed but quickly imposed unusual restrictions. The priest must undergo the same 3D purification ritual as patients. He must vow silence about anything witnessed. Most troubling of all, he would need to consume the same sanctifying substances as patients to ensure his spiritual worthiness to observe divine healing. To Benedetti, these demands were unprecedented. In all his years, true miracles had never required chemical consumption or elaborate prerequisites. Such conditions suggested either psychological manipulation or concealment of procedures that would not appear miraculous to trained eyes. Determined, Benedetti turned to covert investigation, with Mrs. Catherine O'Malley's help her private documentation impressing him for its precision. They began mapping the hospital's layout, tracking staff movements, and recording suspicious deliveries. What they uncovered hinted at a far more elaborate operation than medical treatment. Late-night deliveries arrived 3 times a week, always between 1 and 4 a.m. Wooden crates marked with symbols from medieval alchemy. Glass containers of liquids ranging from clear to purple and strange. Apparatus more suited to laboratories than hospitals were carried inside. Most disturbing were the visits of well-dressed businessmen in expensive suits, who met privately with Dr. Whitman, leaving with guarded sakas. Mrs. O'Malley discovered the basement extended beyond official blueprints, at least 3 concealed chambers accessible only by a hidden entrance into the alley. This allowed people to come and go without ever being seen by patients or visitors. The true breakthrough came in late September 1881, when a young Irish seamstress named Molly Flanagan approached Father Benedetti after Sunday Mass, working late. In her shop facing the hospital's back alley, she had witnessed disturbing sights, but hadn't known whom to trust. Her testimony would unlock the horrifying truth. "My shop window faces the back alley," Molly explained in hushed tones, eyes darting as if afraid of being overheard. "3 nights ago, I saw 4 men carry what looked like a body, wrapped in canvas, out of the hospital's rear door to a wagon. But Father, what froze my blood was that the body moved, not like someone alive and struggling, but twitching, jerking, as if shocked with electricity." Her account grew even more chilling. "I've seen them burning things in metal barrels behind the hospital, always in the middle of the night. The smoke isn't normal, it's thick, green, with a stench so vile I shut my windows, even in hot weather. And Father, I swear on my mother's grave, I've heard screams from underground. Not human screams of pain, but something else. Something that doesn't sound human at all." Father Benedetti knew then he needed tangible proof before making accusations against such a respected institution. He arranged to spend several nights in Molly's shop, observing through her window. What he saw during those vigils would haunt him forever. On the night of October 3, 1881, he watched as Dr. Whitman, Sister Margaret O'Connor, and two unknown men in white coats emerged from the rear entrance carrying a wooden chest about the size of a coffin. Disturbingly, it produced rhythmic tapping like something inside was attempting to communicate in code. They loaded it onto a covered wagon and drove toward the harbor district, returning 3 hours later with the wagon empty. 2 nights after, Benedetti saw an exchange that convinced him urgent action was necessary. A wealthy man in an overcoat arrived at the rear door carrying a leather satchel. After a brief discussion, he handed it to Whitman, and in return received a small vial of dark liquid. As the stranger examined it under the moonlight, Benedetti recognized the practiced gestures of someone familiar with chemicals. It was no holy exchange, but a business deal. This was enough. On October 8, 1881, Father Benedetti slipped through a basement window, guided by his knowledge of the building's layout. What he discovered beneath St. Mercy exceeded even his darkest suspicions. Hidden from all official blueprints, 6 chambers extended below the hospital. The first was a sprawling laboratory, filled with chemical equipment, distillation apparatus, copper coils, glass containers of liquids from clear to thick purple syrups. Meticulous notes in 3 different handwritings recorded experiments, dosages, reactions, and the human responses to each formulation. Horror gripped him as he read. Neurological experiments tracked how mercury compounds altered memory and speech. Cardiovascular tests measured how much poison a human heart could endure before failure. Worst of all, consciousness transfer trials described patients suddenly speaking languages they'd never known, reading Latin texts, or solving advanced mathematics while under chemical influence. The researchers believed they were tapping into some universal knowledge. Benedetti saw only the systematic destruction of human minds. Recorded for profit. Equipment filled the room, organs suspended in fluid, electrical batteries wired to deliver shocks, injection devices calibrated to pierce spinal columns and brain tissue. Glass jars lined the walls with preserved specimens. Brain tissue, hearts damaged by toxins, livers rotted by poison, each carefully labeled with notes about dosages and final words. The second room was no better. Metal tables with restraints, devices for administering controlled shocks, and instruments clearly meant for surgery on conscious patients. Anatomical charts, marked with injection sites and extraction points, decorated the walls. Instruments were arranged with military precision. Bone saws calibrated for cranial openings, syringes sized for tissue depths, vessels to collect blood and organ fluids. The entire design prioritized data over survival. But it was the third room that revealed the true depth of the horror. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each holding patient records far more detailed than anything upstairs. Photographs documented patients before, during, and after treatment. Files weren't organized by name, but by categories: high-tolerance subjects, rapid responders, and most chilling of all expendable test population. With shaking hands, Benedetti realized the so-called cures were survivors of experiments that happened to succeed. The deaths were simply failed trials. Poor Irish immigrants had been chosen as unwilling test subjects for European pharmaceutical syndicates. The staff's true identities were also revealed. Dr. Charles Whitman was actually Klaus Weissmann, a German physician expelled from Heidelberg for unauthorized experiments. Sister Margaret O'Connor was Margaret Osborne, dismissed from London Hospital for theft and falsification. The chaplain was no priest at all, but Robert Steinberg, a con man skilled at performing convincing services. As Father Benedetti photographed evidence, footsteps echoed down the basement stairs. Lantern light flickered closer. Whitman's voice, low and urgent, spoke to a woman Benedetti didn't recognize. "The Vatican investigator is getting too close," Whitman warned. "He's asking about patients we cannot produce. If he uncovers the basement, 16 years of work will be lost. Our contract's destroyed." The woman's voice, crisp with a British accent, answered with cold authority. "Dr. Weissman, Your attachment to this charade is a liability. The syndicate has extracted all value high 213 test subjects, data worth $400,000 in European markets. The Irish experiment has served its purpose. Benedetti froze, blood cold. The woman continued. Our buyers in Vienna, Berlin, and London have received full tolerance studies, hallucinogenic response data, anesthetic thresholds. This will advance medicine by decades, and the beauty of our cover is simple religious healing draws the desperate, the uneducated, the unquestioning. Survivors spread tales of miracles, attracting more subjects. A perfect cycle of exploitation, disguised as charity. Whitman's reply dripped calculation. The Irish trust authority. They are isolated. When they die, no one questions, and the survivors become proof of our legitimacy. Then came the words that chilled Benedetti to his core. What of Benedetti? Whitman asked. He will not complete his investigation, the woman said flatly. Tomorrow, he volunteers for treatment. He has been consuming trace compounds and communion wine for weeks. By tomorrow, his mind will be pliable enough. He will tragically react during prayer. Another holy martyr of Saint Mercy. Realization struck the trap had already been set. He had perhaps 12 hours before becoming the 214th victim. As he moved toward the window, his foot struck a metal container, the sound echoing through stone walls. Silence fell. Then Whitman's voice, calm but deadly. Father Benedetti, there's no need to hide. We know you're here. We know what you've seen. Come upstairs, and let's speak like civilized men. He assured her that the records were nothing more than old administrative notes, meaningless beyond their clerical purpose. Yet, in the following days, Mrs. O'Malley began to notice unsettling patterns others seemed blind to. Many residents of Redemption Hollow displayed behaviors too synchronized to be natural, sleeping and waking at the same precise hours, eating identical meals, speaking with eerily similar phrasing, as if rehearsed. Parents boasted about their children's discipline and obedience, yet when Mrs. O'Malley observed them, the children moved with robotic uniformity, laughing on cue, crying only when permitted, and staring blankly when no instruction was given. It was as though individuality itself had been drained from them. At the same time, she encountered more of the so-called miracle patients. A woman once bedridden with severe heart failure now sprinted through fields like a teenager. An elderly man with advanced dementia recited passages of scripture flawlessly, his memory seemingly rewound. On the surface, these recoveries were wondrous, yet their eyes betrayed something darker. They shone with a fixed, glassy brightness, too intense, too unnatural, as though lit from within by something inhuman. Every conversation she attempted felt scripted. Neighbors responded with the same platitudes. The Lord provides. The treatment saves. Obedience brings light. Always the same tone, always the same phrasing. No one ever expressed doubt, frustration, or even casual complaint. It was a perfection, so absolute that it no longer felt human. Mrs. O'Malley's unease grew into dread. The night she stumbled across a late service in the chapel. Hidden in the shadows, she watched as the congregation filed in silently, each person bowing their head at exactly the same angle, folding their hands at the exact same moment. At the altar, Dr. Keene raised his hands, and the group responded, in perfect unison, not just in words, but in pitch, rhythm, and expression, as though their voices had merged into one. For the first time, she realized Redemption Hollow wasn't merely a place of healing. It was a place of conditioning, of transformation, of something far more sinister than she had ever imagined. Terrified yet unable to turn away, Mrs. O'Malley stayed hidden as the ceremony unfolded. Dr. Keene's words flowed like scripture, yet beneath their surface, she sensed command's subtle rhythmic suggestions that the congregation absorbed without resistance. Their eyes glowed faintly in the candlelight, reflecting the same unyielding devotion. Then came the final act. A frail child was brought forward, trembling but silent. Keene laid his hands upon the boy's head, chanting softly. Within minutes, the child's posture straightened, his gaze sharpened, and the congregation erupted in identical cries of glory through treatment. Mrs. O'Malley's breath caught. The miracle was no miracle at all, it was erasure. The illness, the weakness, the imperfection, gone. But so too was the child's innocence, his individuality, his very humanity. What remained was a vessel perfectly obedient, endlessly devoted, incapable of questioning, staggering back into the night. She understood the truth that the files, the recoveries, and the rituals had all been pointing to. Redemption hollows. Sacred treatment didn't heal. It replaced, and with that knowledge came the most chilling realization of all. Her own husband's boundless health and impossible vitality weren't blessings. They were proof that he, too, had already been remade.